Today I'm working in Hawthorn East, one of Melbourne's inner suburbs, where I'll be giving some attention to a front garden. The front path is the entrance to someone's home. It's the first thing you walk when you arrive, and the last thing you walk when you leave. It sets the tone for everything behind the front door. The old path has already been half pulled up for some plumbing. Rather than patching it back up, we're going to build it properly and really lift this front garden. While I'm at it, there's some matching paving to do down the side of the house as well. The seasons are shifting. Summer has backed off, and the garden is responding. There are dozens of native coria around Melbourne, and right now most of them are putting on a show in their own subtle way. Early wattles are starting to colour up, and everything is adjusting to the change. It's a good time to be outside, and a great time to be landscaping. The remaining bricks from the old path are in good condition. I'm going to put them aside. They'll be used in a future project in this garden. Hawthorn gets its name from Charles Latrobe, who in 1840 remarked that the native scrub in the area, most likely tea trees and wattles, looked like flowering hawthorn bushes. By the 1880s, it had become one of Melbourne's better addresses. Grand Victorian houses, independent schools, prominent churches. Not old money exactly, more the suburb of people who had done well and wanted to live somewhere that reflected it. Merchants, professionals, people on the way up. The genuinely wealthy tended to be further out in Toorak and Kew, where the blocks were bigger. Hawthorn was aspirational. But Hawthorn East was a different story. While the western end was building its reputation, the eastern end, around Auburn, was digging clay out of the ground and firing it into bricks. The physical conditions were brutal. Outdoor work in all weather, heavy clay digging and kiln heat. The workers lived right next to their workplace in small cottages, essentially within sight of the industry that employed them. There was no minimum wage and no workplace protections worth speaking of. They were at the bottom of the wage scale, earning a fraction of what the merchants and professionals a kilometre away were taking home. Hawthorn's bricks, fired in pinks, blacks and browns, went into the polychromatic facades of the houses and buildings that gave the suburb its character. But the people who built Hawthorn couldn't afford to live in it. When the land boom collapsed in the 1890s, the housing industry went with it. Brickworks closed. Workers who had been buying their own homes lost them as the banks foreclosed. The boom ended badly for the people who had made it possible. It's now one of the most expensive postcodes in Melbourne. The clay pits are parks. The workers' cottages are renovated, heritage listed, and highly sought after. These are Oakleigh bricks. They have a good story behind them, which I'll get to shortly. Before the crushed rock goes down, I'm going to put some 50mm PVC pipe under the path. When irrigation is run to this garden, it can be threaded through these and pass underneath without having to dig the path up. The ends get taped to keep the dirt out, and leaving a piece of string through each one means any pipes or cables can be easily pulled through later. The levels on this path are quite technical. The property slopes from the footpath down towards the house, and the last thing we want is water washing onto the front veranda. The way I'm tackling it is to change the slope throughout the path, with the lowest point sitting on the main curve. From there, we can slope away from the veranda and tilt it slightly towards the garden bed to avoid any pooling. At the other end, the last section needs to twist to match the slope of the driveway, but I don't want that slope running the full length of the path. It would make it awkward to walk on. The bricks that just got dropped off carry the Oakleigh stamp and were made about 15 kilometres southeast of here. Oakleigh has a remarkably similar story to Hawthorn East. A suburb built on clay, with men doing the same hard, dirty work in the same era, under the same conditions. Back in the day, Oakleigh wasn't some quiet suburb. It was right in the thick of Melbourne's brickmaking scene, all because of the clay right underfoot there. That stuff was so good, they turned the whole area into pits, kilns, and works that churned out bricks for houses, walls, and everything else going up around the city. It was tough, hands-on stuff. One of the main Oakleigh brick sites had about 60 men working at full tilt, digging clay, mixing it in those old horse-drawn pug mills, pressing bricks by hand, and feeding the kilns non-stop. Then, the machines rolled in, stuff shipped over from England, and suddenly the output went through the roof. That shift from sweat and horses to proper industrial gear is what made places like Oakleigh tick for over a century. The land was originally sold by a man named Howard Clarton, although he also went by a few other names. He'd married one woman in South Australia, moved to India, married another woman there while still married to the first, moved that second family to Melbourne, worked as a land agent, and never stayed in one place more than 4 years. He appears regularly in court records. The street was originally named after him, however at some point it was changed to Stanford Road. Make of that what you will. The pits got deep, over 150 feet in places, starting as inclined shafts that opened into massive working faces. They were like underground worlds. In 1938, 2 men were working at the bottom of the quarry face when about 15 tons of rock fell from 10 meters above and crushed them. Their workmates dug them out with their hands. The company's inspector testified the quarry had always been worked with reasonable care, and that the collapse was due to an unusual formation in the rock, essentially arguing it couldn't have been predicted. The jury disagreed. It happened that the jury foreman was an old miner, someone who knew exactly what proper inspection looked like. They found the company negligent for failing to properly inspect the face. The coroner asked them to reconsider. They refused. After the war, many of the men who came home weren't willing to go back into the brickworks. And who could blame them? Before the war, there were 34 brickyards operating across Melbourne, employing over 1,000 men. After it, only 600 returned to the pits, because for some, there was nothing else. Now the clay is all dug out, and the works are long gone. The land's turned into parks and streets. But these bricks, they've outlasted it all. They've already done a job somewhere out there, and now they're going into this path for the next stage in life. The Hilux has been on every job for the past 12 years. Today, it passes the baton to a much younger D-Max. It's always a great feeling getting a new work vehicle. It's almost like I get older, but they stay the same age. Every trade has its essential tools. For a landscaper, it's not the plate compactor or the angle grinder. It's the ute. It's there on every job, every day, from the first load to the last cleanup. Everything else comes and goes, depending on the work. The ute is always there. Now, this is a curved path, so unlike straight paving, I can't use string lines to guide the rows. It has to be done by eye. What I can do is set one height line for the first row. Using a level, I can make sure that first row goes in at the correct height and angle by following the string. After that, every row is done off the one before it with a level. No more string. With the first row locked in, it's just me, the level, and a few hours of paving ahead, which is a good time to talk about the Aussie ute and where it came from. The story goes that back in 1933, a farmer's wife from Gippsland wrote a letter to Ford Australia. She and her husband couldn't afford 2 vehicles and wanted something that could get them to church on Sunday and carry pigs to market on Monday. The 22-year-old engineer at Ford's Geelong plant named Lewis Bant was given the problem. He took a 1933 coupe, extended the rear body panel all the way back, strengthened the chassis to carry a load, and the result rolled off the line in 1934 as the Ford Coupe Utility, the first Australian ute designed and built right here in Victoria. I can already feel the outrage coming through the camera. So before any of you American viewers start typing angry comments, yes, the Americans had pickup trucks before this. But they were truck-based, with a separate cab and tray bolted on. What Bant built was different. The tray was integrated into the body of a passenger car, one continuous structure. Australians have argued ever since that this makes it a distinct invention rather than a copy. It's a reasonable argument. Though it's also worth noting that Australians have a long history of claiming things that aren't actually theirs. Phar Lap, the Pavlova, Crowded House, the Flat White, all from New Zealand, and all happily claimed by the Australians as their own. Russell Crowe is also a Kiwi, though in that case New Zealand seemed fairly happy to let him go. Holden followed Ford in 1951 with their own version. The waiting list in the first year was around 70,000, in a country with a population of under 9 million. Ford and Holden traded the market back and forth for the next 60 years, until both stopped making cars in Australia in 2016 and 2017. When local manufacturing ended, so did the original ute. What replaced it were Japanese and American pickups, separate cab, separate tray, and truck-based like the American pickup. The thing Bant designed no longer exists in production, but the word stayed. In Australia, if it's got a tray, it's a ute, regardless of how it's built or where it comes from. Strictly speaking, the Hilux and the D-Max are both pickups by the original definition, but good luck telling that to anyone on an Australian job site. This side area is a bit different to the front path in terms of drainage. Rather than sloping it towards a garden bed, we're sloping it into the middle of the paving, keeping water away from both houses and letting it run down to a strip drain at the bottom. The gate and the concrete beyond it will be redone at some point, but that's not this video. Those bricks we saved from the old front path are going to get a second life here as well. When the concrete gets redone, they'll border it to make it feel more deliberate rather than just a slab sitting there. Unlike the curved front path, I can actually use string lines here. It makes the whole process significantly faster. The string gives me a continuous reference for height and alignment. I still use the level constantly to make sure everything is sitting perfectly flat and falling on the correct angle, but having the string there as a guide speeds things up considerably. To tie this space into the front garden, I'm going to curve the garden bed and border it with the same pattern we used on the front path. The side passage of a house has always been the forgotten space. In the Victorian era, it had a very specific purpose. Coal deliveries came through here, tradesmen came through here, and night soil collection came through here. Everything that kept a household running, but wasn't fit to be seen from the street, came down the side. The front was for presentation. The side was for everything else. As houses modernized with sewerage systems, gas and refrigeration, most of those functions disappeared, and the side passage went with them. It became the place you put the bins, some spare roofing tiles, empty plant pots, an old coiled-up garden hose, and that forgotten bag of potting mix from 3 years ago that now has holes in it. This one is getting some attention. It's not going to be a feature space. It doesn't need to be. But by using the same brick and carrying the same curved border detail through from the front path, it stops feeling like a separate afterthought and starts feeling like part of the same garden. That connection matters. A side passage that ties into the front garden turns dead space into something that actually links the street to the rest of the property. And that's worth doing properly. This path curves for a reason. There's a long tradition in garden design of using curves to change how you experience a space. A straight path is efficient, it gets you where you're going, and there's nothing wrong with that. But a curved path does something different. It slows you down slightly and makes the journey feel more deliberate. There's a shift in mood as you walk. You're not just moving from the gate to the front door, you're arriving. It's a small thing, but the people who walk it will feel it, even if they can't explain why. In the 1880s, a landscape designer named William Guilfoyle, the man responsible for the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, was actively pushing back against the rigid straight lines that dominated European garden design at the time. He introduced curves into Australian private gardens, not for decoration, but because he understood that the way you move through a space changes how you experience it. That idea hasn't changed, but somewhere along the way, it got lost. Melbourne's newer suburbs are full of front paths that nobody really put any thought into. A straight line of concrete from the gate to the door, poured and forgotten before the house was even finished. The curve on the front path isn't there just because it looks nice. It's there because it changes how you arrive at the house. It makes the path feel considered rather than just functional. And when the garden around it is planted, which is the next stage of this project, that curve will become the spine that everything else grows around. And for this garden, it's just the beginning. Autumn doesn't last long in Melbourne. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it. The new rig passed its first test and has remained remarkably clean. At least for now.